Hello and welcome to India Speak, the podcast by Center for Policy Research. I'm Shyam Saran and I'm Senior Fellow at the Center, and I have served earlier as India's Foreign Secretary. This is the first episode in our series, which features very distinguished experts in international relations, foreign policy, as well as diplomacy. Today we are going to be looking at the subject of multilateralism. And the potential for cooperation amongst states, particularly when confronted with what are becoming very cross-cutting global challenges, like the one which we are living through, the pandemic itself. And I have with me Ambassador Asoke Mukerji to really have a conversation about this subject. But of course, much of the talking will be done by him, not by me. So welcome, Asoke, to this podcast. We are very honored to have you on our podcast series. Let me just introduce Ambassador Asoke Mukerji. He's a retired Foreign Service officer like me, but his last assignment was in New York, where he was ambassador and permanent representative of India to the United Nations, a very, very prestigious and important post. And he has also been involved in other key multilateral assignments. For example, he was India's trade negotiator at the World Trade Organization. That's what from 1995 to 1998. And also at the United Nations itself, he has handled some very, very important and complex issues such as, cybersecurity or counter terrorism. And we will have a chance to speak about those as well. He has also served in the United Kingdom, the Russian Federation, the United Arab Emirates, the US, and the former Yugoslavia. So he has had a very varied kind of career in various geographies across the world. So let me begin by pointing out to you and perhaps eliciting your reaction to this. Today, as I said, most of the challenges which states are confronted with are truly global in dimension. So look at the pandemic. There is no hope of being able to really overcome this challenge unless states work together, coordinate their actions, because even if one person is not safe, the whole world is not safe. I mean, that's the kind of situation we are in. We have just recently had the Glasgow Climate Summit. And that is another challenge of global dimension. Again, no matter what each country does by itself, will not really make a difference as far as the overall challenge is concerned. I give the example as a climate change negotiator that even if India's emissions became zero tomorrow by some miracle, would that stop climate change? It would not. We would still be affected by it. So there are a whole range of issues. Cybersecurity is something that you dealt with. Counterterrorism is something that you dealt with. These are all, in the nature of global challenges. And yet, when the need for multilateralism, need for multilateral approaches, empowered international institutions which can actually deliver some of those solutions, when that need has become so compelling, we are actually moving in the reverse direction, isn't it? So how do you look at this paradox that we are confronted with?
Right. Well, thank you very much, sir, for inviting me, and I'm very happy to interact with you on this topic of multilateralism. I feel that a lot of times we take multilateralism for granted, that it's there somewhere and it's always benign. But and sometimes I've come across situations where multilateralism is also seen as something that is esoteric and not related to our day-to-day lives. But I think that there are 2 points that I would like to make in a very broad sense at the beginning. The first is that multilateralism and what we call bilateralism in our foreign relations are complementary. They feed each other, and therefore you cannot have a situation where you only pursue one and ignore the other. You have to do both. And I think the major powers, and especially the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, follow this pattern, and I think it's worth keeping that in mind. The second is that multilateralism impacts on our day-to-day lives, despite our not probably being very conscious of it. And I was asked this question when I went to New York by our Prime Minister. He said that, how does this United Nations make a difference for us? And I said that, there's simple things. For example, the polio vaccination campaign came through the World Health Organization. The Green Revolution had a role of the Food and Agriculture Organization. Our developmental program, the IIT in Bombay, which was one of our first IITs, had a multilateral support system, and so on. So, and today, and that's the point that I'd really like to make, today that is the central agenda of multilateralism, what we call Agenda 2030. Now, Agenda 2030 seems to be a subject of great discussion among think tanks. And in India, Niti Aayog is the leading think tank involved with Agenda 2030. But having negotiated Agenda 2030 in those 2.5 years in New York, I think that the fact that Agenda 2030 has 2 dimensions which make it completely enmeshed in our day-to-day lives needs to be kept in account. One dimension is that it is a creation of multiple stakeholders. It is not only governments who created Agenda 2030. Agenda 2030 was created with the participation of business, of academia, and most important, of civil society, including the youth. So they were all present in the hall. It's quite unfortunate that from India, we didn't have this participation at that time. But many of the other countries participated through this multiple stakeholder approach. And when it comes to implementing the outcome, then you have a role for the same stakeholders who have brought their issues onto the agenda itself. So therefore, it's an interactive 2-way process. The second point is that in implementing Agenda 2030, there were some of us, India, Brazil especially, who took the lead in those years, 2013 to 2015, of focusing on the role of technology in implementing development. Now, that is a perspective which till today is somehow considered to be a preserve of only the developed countries, and developing countries are seen to be trying to break a system of intellectual property rights to get their hands on technology. Unfortunately, the same approach is playing out today as we speak on COVID, where there's a whole logjam, if I may call it that, in the World Trade Organization on how to deal with a proposal to have a waiver from the trade-related intellectual property rights of the World Trade Organization for the manufacture of vaccines against COVID. So that's an example. And therefore, the point that I'd like to make is that multilateralism actually affects us in a very, very direct way, although many times we may not be conscious of it, and in a related way. And because we are meeting on this platform of Zoom, even this technology of information and communications technology, or what we call the digital technology today, that also came into our lives through multilateralism. I remember I was the negotiator in basic telecoms in 1997, and there was a focus on getting an outcome for opening the markets of every country that was participating. In 1997, India's focus was on the landline sector. We did not have mobile telephony. So our mandate from the cabinet was that you have an agreement to open the market, but in a phased way, so that we are not taken by surprise. So we have a 5-year period for phasing in foreign access into the Indian market for landlines. Now, one morning, the Brazilian delegate and myself, we were colleagues in textile negotiations, he came to me and with a piece of paper and said, "Have you seen this paper, and why weren't you at the meeting?" So I said, "What was the meeting?" He said it was a meeting convened by South Korea and the United States to discuss this paper, on the top of which was printed Spectrum. So I said, "Thank you for telling me this, but now I must tell our people who have come from India about this subject." And I went to our Secretary Telecom, who was leading our delegation at that time, And he looked at it and he said, spectrum is something in the rules of business in India under the Ministry of Defense. We have nothing to do with it. So that is our internal situation. So when I went back to the negotiation and we were concluding the negotiation, which meant we had to sign on the outcome document. And when the paper came to us, and I had very fortunately a technical engineer from the Post and Telegraph Department with me to advise. And I said, what should I sign on this column which says spectrum? He said, just sign unbound, meaning don't limit it. And that was his advice as a technical person. And I took that risk, if I may call it that, a risk at that time. But today, all of us have smartphones in our pockets, and that's how multilateralism works. So
I agree with you, Ashok. In fact, you are only reinforcing what I started with, that multilateralism is becoming such a compelling thing in our world today. And what example that you gave is really demonstrative of that. What I want you to focus on is that given that compulsion that we have, would you not agree that we are, in a sense, the impression is that we are going in the reverse direction? And the inability to actually come up with those kind of multilateral approaches precisely to handle some of these issues. What do we do with that?
Well, I agree with you, and I think that to address this topic, one needs to take a step back and go into the period between 1943 to 1948, when the current multilateral structures were conceptualized and created. And at that time, the conception was that there were two big areas. One was to secure the peace. And that is the structure that we confront every day in our lives today. The United Nations Security Council, the mandate given in the UN Charter to the 5 countries who are called the Permanent 5 or P5 of the Security Council to secure the peace. But simultaneously, there was a process to sustain the peace. And I think a lot of us have forgotten about it. But to sustain the peace, the international institutions were conceptualized, and there were 2 sets of institutions. The first set was the institutions created by the Bretton Woods Conference, the International Monetary Fund, the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, or the World Bank. And they were to coordinate a supportive role for financial and for development policies to sustain the peace. And the third institution, which was conceptualized, but unfortunately never came up until 1995, was the International Trade Organization, because the triggers of the Second World War included protectionism, something that we are seeing again today. So therefore, you have this process. The other part of sustaining the peace was to reach to the family of specialized agencies set up during the League of Nations time, which could play a role as supporting the work of the United Nations in securing the peace. So you have the World Health Organization, the FAO, and so on and so forth. There are 17 such organizations today, and new organizations have been created. But the problem goes into the malfunctioning of the multilateral system. The malfunctioning of the multilateral system from 1946 till 1990 was essentially due to the Cold War. And the Cold War polarized the 5 permanent members. And along with those 5 permanent members were several countries which were part of their larger family. And you had NATO on one side, you had Warsaw Pact on the other side, and you had a group which didn't want to be either in NATO or Warsaw Pact, and that's the non-aligned group as it came to be known in 1961. But in 1948, when the United Nations started implementing its vision and its charter, you already had the beginning of what we see today as the polarization between the major powers. And I think it's worth looking at this because India was a signatory of the UN Charter in 1945. And yet in 1946, when the General Assembly met for its first session in London, in India's statement, you have a reference to the compromise that India was very unhappy with in the UN Charter. The compromise was on what I call the anomaly of the UN Charter, the giving of the veto power to these P5 countries. And I think that in the statement of India in 1946, there is an expectation that in 10 years' time, the veto would be reviewed and would not be used, would not be there actually in the UN Charter. These are the words of Ramaswamy Mudaliar, who signed the UN Charter on behalf of India. Now, look at the charter. There is Article 109. Article 109 is very clear. It says that in 10 years' time from the date the charter comes into effect, the provisions of the charter will be reviewed. But because of the Cold War, this never happened. And till today, we haven't had a review of the charter. So one way to address the issue that you have raised of the malfunctioning of the multilateral system, and especially with the United Nations as the most universal of all the multilateral institutions, is to have a review of the UN Charter. Now, that is easier said than done.
Yeah, sure. I mean, the structure has these, in a sense, certain flaws that do militate against the kind of role that these international institutions should play. But then, all these organizations really are what the members make them to be. It's not as if they have a certain kind of a independent, agency in that sense. You mentioned the P5, and you mentioned the veto. Now, while you have drawn attention to the fact that, the Cold War polarized, especially the 5 permanent members, and therefore the possibility of the UN really performing its mandated role was therefore, in a sense, diminished. But, we also see that even during the worst years of the Cold War, the P5 were very, very zealous in protecting their own privileges. I mean, the classic example is the Non-Proliferation Treaty. I mean, India was one of the initiators of those negotiations, if you remember. But when it came to the final, outcome, the 5, in a sense, not the 5 at that time, the 4 in that sense, they banded together and created this very unequal kind of a world of the nuclear haves and the nuclear have-nots. And you have just recently seen the P5 statement on nuclear war. And I have responded to that by saying that if these being weapons of mass destruction, how do you achieve what you say you want to achieve if the other nuclear weapon states who are there, who are not part of the NPT but are nuclear weapon states nevertheless, if they are not in that process? Going further, how do you make this happen if other stakeholders, which are all the entire community of non-nuclear weapon states, if they are not part of this process, how do you make this happen? And there is a illogic in terms of saying nuclear war must never be fought, they can never be won, and at the same time refuse to, for example, have what we have been suggesting as India, a convention on the prohibition of the use or threat of use of nuclear weapons pending nuclear disarmament. So there is this dichotomy also, don't you see? I mean, what has been your experience? I mean, you have been PR in New York. What is your impression about the functioning of the P5 at the United Nations? Can you give us some insight into that?
Well, you're right, and you have described it in broad terms and specifically with reference to non-proliferation. And I agree with what you have said. On the ground, the P5 in 2021 are very different from what the P5 were when the charter was signed. And I think that's the first point. That in 1945, you had a tremendous enthusiasm and participation of the United States of America, which conceptualized the United Nations. The United Nations itself are words used by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and he's the one who brought it into international relations. So you had the US leadership in 1945. Today, in 2021, you do not see the United States as playing any leadership role within the multilateral system, and especially in the United Nations, and particularly in the UN Security Council. So I think that this is something that has created space or made the entire enterprise drift because of the lack of the continuing commitment of the United States to leading on the ground. And the best example in recent years of what I'm saying is that when the United States decided to shift its embassy to Jerusalem, They also went to the multilateral system in the UN General Assembly and put a resolution and asked for a vote on whether this was approved. This is part of the multilateral approach to the topic or not. And the end result was that only 9 countries voted with the United States out of 193. So that was very revealing of where the United States stands in terms of the larger international community. And within the permanent 5, within the Security Council, 15 members, which are dominated by the permanent 5 because of their veto power, the United States has not been able to play a leadership role, which means also to implement what it sets out to do. The best example of that, which I've written about, is the Afghanistan situation. In 2011, soon after Osama bin Laden was killed, within a month, the United States is the country that drafted the resolution adopted in June 2011, which called for reintegrating the Taliban into the political structure of Afghanistan. And to do that, they bifurcated the counterterrorism sanctions list into a sanctions list for Al-Qaeda and a sanctions list for the Taliban. And the Taliban sanctions list was supposed to be whittled down as Taliban became part of the mainstream political process in Afghanistan. That was a US idea. But all the 5 agreed to it. All the other 4 permanent members agreed to it. That's why the resolution was adopted unanimously. Now, fast forward to 2020 and 2021. In 2020, the United States decided to do a bilateral agreement with the Taliban in the Doha Agreement. And they also did a bilateral agreement with the Ashraf Ghani government. And they brought both these agreements into a UN Security Council resolution, which meant that they would both have to be implemented together. And the United Nations Security Council in March 2020 adopted a unanimous resolution approving this. Now, in August 2021, when the United States announced its withdrawal and withdrew its troops from Afghanistan, they did not play a leadership role in implementing the 2 Security Council resolutions that they themselves had drafted. And instead, they allowed a faulty outcome, if I may call it that, a tilted outcome in which you have one party, the Taliban, now controlling Afghanistan. Now, has the United States learned from this experience? And my information from New York is no. Even now, when we are dealing with the restructuring of the United Nations Assistance Mission to Afghanistan, UNAMA, the United States is, as the drafter of the resolution, is playing a role in which it is opposing attempts by countries like France and India to impose conditionalities on the Taliban so that the humanitarian assistance that flows of $4 billion worth is not going to be used by them to consolidate themselves in power. They have a commitment for an inclusive government in the Doha Agreement. They have to implement that thing. So therefore, this is the United States. Now you look at the other big player, which in the Second World War, the Soviet Union. Now, Soviet Union played a status quo role. The Soviet Union is largely responsible for the introduction of the veto because that was the price paid to get the Soviet Union to join the United Nations. Now, in the first 15 years, the Soviet Union used its veto very, very frequently to block new countries from joining the General Assembly of the United Nations because they felt that all these countries would be voting on the side of the United States and of the Cold War divide between the East and West. But in 1960, and that's one of the great achievements of countries like India in the United Nations, the process which we today call decolonization came to a head, and unanimously the 5 permanent members agreed not to use their veto to block new countries. And that led to the changed character of the United Nations on the ground. But in the Security Council, the P5 were, as you said, were bent on keeping their privileges, and the main privilege, the crown jewel that they hold, is the veto. When you call for UN Security Council reform today, you immediately find the P5 are in one group against the rest of the world because they feel that the reform will take away the veto. And actually, the reform has to take away the veto because the rest of the UN Charter doesn't have this provision.
No, quite right. I see the point that you are making. I'm only wondering whether, in the experience that you have had, as India's PR at the UN, you have come across this aspect that while there may be political tensions and there may be confrontation like today, for example, between the US and China. And yet we had the P5 statement on nuclear war, which was obviously negotiated amongst them. And I was also surprised to find that actually this P5 process, as it is called, has been in place in Geneva at the Conference on Disarmament for quite a few years. So that's something which is important. Now, we have not much time left, so I wanted to focus attention on India and multilateralism. And you mentioned the fact that, in the early years, how India, was in a sense a champion of the United Nations. If you look at Mr. Nehru's writings, this was an institution in which there were pretty high hopes which had been, built in. And you also had India, despite the fact that it was a developing country, much weaker in a sense than it is today. If you look at it in pure power terms, economic capabilities or security capabilities, India actually was one of the most active players on the international stage. And particularly at the United Nations. If you take, for example, decolonization, if you take, for example, the mobilizing international public opinion against apartheid in South Africa. Much more important, many people do not even perhaps know this, that India played a critical role in the drafting of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. At a time where both the United States and the then Soviet Union were actually not very happy with that initiative. Or you take many of the disarmament-related issues. When I was posted in Geneva from 1980 to 1983 to what was then known as the Committee on Disarmament. And I had the privilege of taking part in the special session on disarmament in New York. I stayed in New York something like 3 months, for the preparatory work and the conference itself. And there was such a tremendous amount of, shall I say, energy amongst the developing countries, amongst the non-aligned countries to push ahead with international security and disarmament related issue. And India was right up there in front. In mobilizing that, and quite successfully. We may not have been able to achieve many practical results, but certainly in terms of mobilizing international public opinion for some of these issues, India actually played a huge role. So when I look at that kind of activism, that kind of energy that India brought to multilateral diplomacy during that phase, maybe because I have perhaps rather pink memories about that period, but somehow it appears to me that that seems to have flagged somewhat. Is that your experience, or is it that we are working in a different kind of a way in multilateralism?
Well, I think what you've said is right. The three major contributions of India to the human rights structures of multilateralism, as you mentioned, are non-discrimination, the anti-apartheid movement, the empowerment of women, gender equality, Hansa Mehta's role in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and the outlawing of mass atrocity crimes. Most people forget that India was the sponsor of the genocide, of the resolution which resulted in the Convention Against Genocide in 1948. And so therefore, these were major initiatives. And then, of course, decolonization. Now, I would say that as the United Nations and multilateralism itself has evolved in these last 75, 76 years, the focus has come to development and to sustainable development. And I think that this is something that India is naturally positioned to play a leadership role, a role not only to implement the goals that are set before us, but also to conceptualize the goals and to suggest ways in which the process works on the ground on the basis of our experience. That is what gives India what I call a constituency in multilateralism and among countries across the world. The relevance of our experience of development for their processes of development. And that is the main concern of most countries in the multilateral system today, is on what affects them. I mean, climate change affects a large number of them. And therefore they want multilateralism to support them in their efforts to combat climate change. Similarly, growing expectation that there is a huge dimension of the digital world which is coming into being. And here is something that actually countries like India should play a leadership role, but that is not very visible in the multilateral structures. And the downside of India not articulating either the sustainable development issues or the digital issues, the downside of that is that the multilateral system itself carries on getting fragmented or becoming like silos, much like what has happened in nuclear disarmament. So, for example, in sustainable development, now the focus is on something called oceans. Now, India has declared a huge policy of Sagar from 2015 onwards as a maritime country and a maritime power. And yet India is nowhere in the corridors of multilateral discussions on the agenda of the oceans, which will be adopted in June this year.
But why is that?
That is because there is a gap between the conceptualization and the implementation on the ground. I think we do not have as yet a pool of people who will actually work in the negotiating halls of multilateral institutions to implement what we say are our objectives. And that has happened in the World Health Organization. When we became chair of the executive board, everybody thought that was where India would make a difference and this COVID vaccine issue would be resolved. But 1 year later, when we finished our chairmanship, nothing happened. And that's because there's a lack of trained and focused negotiators on the ground.
So you are saying that this is lack of capacity?
I'm saying it's not only lack of capacity, but lack of priority of resource allocation. Because, for example, for digital issues, India is a country which has used digital technology so intensely in the last 7 years, there should be no shortage of people. But today, there are no negotiators from India in the halls of multilateralism where they are setting the norms, the standards, the policies on digital issues.
So then you are actually ending up with norms being actually put in place and rules of the game being put in place in the framing of which you have not had any role.
That's right. And
isn't that rather risky?
That is risky, and that leads to the other perception that India is continually a naysayer. Now, India is not actually a naysayer as in terms of our basic DNA, as we talked about in the early years of multilateralism. India was interested and involved in also creating the multilateral agenda, and we succeeded with decolonization and sustainable development.
But Ashok, I mean, surely we had less capacity in the 50s and the 60s, and today we ought to have more capacity, isn't it? I mean, so is that because there has not been a sort of a recognition at the political level that this is really important and that we need to build up, our capacities? I mean, you have seen how difficult it was, for example, to get a sanction for the increase in numbers of the Foreign Service itself. We have just actually managed to get over a 10-year period a doubling of something like 750 that we started off with, and we will still end up with 1500, which is grossly inadequate when you come to looking at the sort of extent of engagement that we have with the rest of the world. So if that is the sort of at the political level there is an issue, is there some way that we can really push this? Because I do feel that we are losing out in a sense, because this was my experience during the time that I was a Sherpa for the Prime Minister when the G8 and G5 process had started, and then we had the G20. A lot of the work was actually being done in smaller working groups. Once the decisions were taken at the high level, in which we were very, very active. But when it came to, as you say, actually doing the nitty-gritty work in those committees and the working groups, India was absent. And I think this is really something that we really need to address very, very, very quickly.
Yes, I think that it's very important, and especially because of what I talked about in terms of leadership of multilateral ideas and systems. Now, if you have a country which, like the United States, has withdrawn, you still have nature abhors a vacuum, and now you have other countries which have stepped in there. For example, China is the biggest player, and we all talk about it. But what do we do about it is also important. And I gave the example of the Oceans Conference because you and I know about the Chinese maritime interests and their national, the BRI and their maritime BRI and everything like that. But what is happening on the ground is there's an alignment of their national interests with their multilateral structures. They are doing the same in the cyber and digital world.
In virtually every field, actually. I mean, and they really put a lot of attention to really building up capacity. I'll give you an example. When I was at the Committee on Disarmament in 1980, and they had just joined the year before, I was one single delegate handling the plenary, handling all the informal meetings, handling the working groups. And the Chinese delegation had 17 or 18 people who one person would be talking, but there would be 16 of them sitting behind and furiously taking notes. So, I mean, there was a very, very deliberate effort to build up capacity, knowing that they were lacking in terms of expertise, but they made every effort possible to build up. Ashok, we don't have much time, so I want to just put the last question to you. And this is India's own sort of claim to be a permanent member of the Security Council. This is every now and then it comes up. There is a view, this is a waste of time. Why are you putting effort in this when we know that nothing is going to come out of it? As someone who has been PR to New York, as someone whom I'm sure has had to deal with this issue off and on, what is your own view?
Well, I think it is not a waste of time because of one reason, and that is that it's in the Charter, and the Charter is a legal treaty. In the Charter, the Security Council decisions are binding on all members of the United Nations, Article 25 of the Charter. So if there are decisions of the Security Council which go against India, and there have been several cases which have been written about by me, including by me, then India must be at the table as an equal partner in taking those decisions. Now, our experience in the last 1 year in the Security Council has shown the limitations of being an elected member because we don't have the veto power. So we cannot, even the Afghanistan resolution that we talk about of 31st August last year was drafted by the United States. It was not drafted by India. And therefore, I think that equal membership of the Security Council is important. Now, the reason why it's not a waste of time and resources is because India has aspirations. And even if you take that figure of a $5 trillion economy, to reach that objective, we have to have a supportive international environment. A lot of decisions of the Security Council affect that international environment around us, including on issues which are maritime, on which we have several examples, but also on continental issues, on war and peace on our borders. Now, all these issues are under the Charter in the remit of the UN Security Council, and any decision it takes is going to have an impact on us. And then there's the larger issues, which you mentioned right at the beginning, the global issues, on which the Security Council so far, because of its fragmentation or its lack of leadership, has not taken a role. But supposing there is a resolution on COVID, or supposing there's a resolution on digital economies, on cybersecurity, that resolution will be binding on us. So it's far better for us to be inside the tent to participate in making sure that those decisions reflect our interests and concerns, rather than having to respond.
Yeah, I agree why it is important, but is it likely? I mean, I think the question that people are putting is that why are you putting so much of effort on an issue where you know that there is not likely to be much traction for at least for the foreseeable future?
Well, I think I would just give an answer to that by saying that for a long time, when I was there also, they said it will take a third world war to recreate this structure. And I would say that the COVID pandemic is equal in impact to a third world war, because what has happened has affected every country and most of humanity. And therefore, we must take this opportunity to call. The only way it can be done through negotiation is by convening the General Conference, which is promised in Article 109 of the Charter. Nobody wants to speak of it. The P5 don't want to speak of it because they don't want to change. But the rest of the world has to come together And it's a simple vote, a majority vote of the General Assembly and 7 members of the Security Council without giving any veto. So it's a doable proposition to hold the General Conference. And I would suggest that we should actually convert that summit that the Secretary General wants to convene in 2023 into this General Conference. And the General Conference has the power to review the charter, and that's the way the Security Council reform can take place, because everything under that will be on the basis of the rules of procedure of the General Assembly, which is a 2/3 majority vote. If we cannot get 129 countries to agree on Security Council reform, then I agree with you that it is a waste of time.
Well, I think with very accomplished diplomats who have served in that position, I'm sure that our diplomats are certainly up to it. But I think that's an important point that you have made, why it is important to keep our claim alive on this issue. Ashok, thank you very much. We have run out of time, but it has been a most engaging conversation. I think we have learned a great deal from you. You have offered us insights which very rarely, are available to a general audience. And I'm sure that people who will listen to this podcast will greatly benefit from it. Thank you very much and have a very nice day.
Thank you, sir. And I wish all our listeners a good day also.
Thank you for listening, and for more information on our work, please follow us on Twitter at CPR_India. And you can also log into our website at www.cprindia.org. Thank you very much.